Have you got a guitar or bass that hums or buzzes somehow? Maybe that hum and buzz stops when you touch the strings or touch the bridge or touch one of the metal components on the guitar. Well, don't worry, one thing that will help eliminate that hum is good cavity shielding. Hi people, Daniel from Devil & Sons Guitars here, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to apply that cavity shielding. I've already got other videos that show you that shielding works, but I will talk about how it works and why it works today. But first let me just show you that I'm using this product from NitorLACK. It's a paint-on conductive shielding, and if you've seen my previous videos about shielding, you'll know that that is my favourite way to apply the shielding, and I'll talk about why a bit later on. But just a demo to show what this actually is. It's essentially a paint with graphite mixed in with it, and as you saw I gave it a stir and a shake beforehand to make sure everything's quite evenly mixed. It's actually water based and non-toxic, which means it's very easy to wash your brushes afterwards. And then I'm just simply painting it on to a piece of paper, and once it's dry, as you can see here, it becomes conductive. So if I connect the wires here, one from the battery, one from the LED, to each end of the mark I've just made on the paper, you'll see the LED comes on. Now let's quickly talk about why you will need shielding. As I said, I've done an experiment which I'll link to in the description where I show some of the differences you get by having shielding in. Essentially it eliminates the hum that you might get from your guitar when it's picking up the natural interference, the electromagnetic interference, the interference from your general electrical objects around you. Sometimes that's referred to as the 60 or 50 cycle hum. Now the aim is to paint all of the cavities, with the odd exception that I'm going to mention later. Now if, like me, you've got a little bit that's gone over the edge here, don't worry, if you wipe it up straight away it comes off quite easily. You can wipe it into the cavity, not away from, because you don't want to spread it everywhere. NitorLACK actually recommend using some tape around the edges. They sell tape which is designed to peel away really easily without marking your guitar. But as I'll show you in a minute, sometimes you need to go over the edges. This cavity is for a humbucker. Now, you don't necessarily actually have to shield a humbucker. Humbuckers are designed to eliminate hum themselves. And one thing about humbuckers is, as well as the way the coils are designed to cancel out the hum, they also tend to have a metal base to them, which is essentially the same as putting the shielding underneath. And again, I've got videos explaining how humbuckers work and how that compares to a single coil. Now you can see here that the cavity that the single coil is in isn't connected to the other cavities, so I'm going to show you later on how I make sure I connect those up together. Now, comments in my previous videos often talk about this idea of a Faraday cage, which is this concept that if you completely shield off your electrical items, they will be protected from the electromagnetic sources from outside. Now obviously it's almost impossible to completely shield off your entire guitar. Now NitorLACK recommend, once this is dry, putting a second coat on to ensure there's no gaps, but I found that this is such good quality and it's nice and thick that if you're really careful you're not going to get any gaps, so I haven't bothered doing a second coat. But you may want to do that yourself just to be extra sure. There's plenty in the bottle. They say enough for 5 to 10 guitars. But if you think about the idea of a cage, it's not a solid shielding all around it. It is in fact a cage. So cages have got gaps in it. So what we're trying to do is create a shielding that grounds all of the metal parts of your guitar, all the wiring together. It means you can create a ground loop. Now what happens is you normally have your bridge as part of that loop. So you have a wire, which we'll talk about in a moment, that links into that ground loop, and that wire means that your bridge is part of it, and then your strings which are touching it are part of it too, and your strings go over your pickups, so they're kind of surrounding your pickups in a way. And here's quite an important element. I'm actually painting on the surface of the guitar here. These stripes I'm painting link the cavity to the surface, which is really important when I end up putting on the scratch plate, which is going to have an aluminium covering underneath it. Now you can actually put the conductive shielding paint on the underside of your scratch plate, but I'm actually using these aluminium strips partly so I can show you the difference between using paint and the aluminium, and why I don't like the aluminium. I mean, it is quite fiddly and there are some issues with it. And the reason you want to shield the back of your pickguard is it helps make that ground loop surrounding all your electrical components. Bear in mind though, you don't necessarily have to cover the whole of the back of the scratch plate, because sometimes the cavity is only, like in this case, in the center part of the scratch plate. Now, I'm just using these strips. Sometimes you can get larger areas that you can put down, and sometimes scratch plates already come with it on. Now, here's something that's important. I've laid these bits of aluminium on top of each other, and the glue underneath isn't necessarily conductive on most of these foils. So what I want to do is make sure that there is a conductivity that goes across all three pieces of tape that I've put down. And the way I tend to do that normally is by putting another piece going in the opposite direction that goes across all of them and folding it over slightly. So that folded bit makes contact with all three pieces in this case, ensuring that there's no adhesive glue to get in the way. And then of course I'm trimming it up to make it look nice and neat. The important thing here is this is going to touch those strips of paint that earlier on I put on the body around the cavity holes. So it's going to make this part of the conductive loop, part of the circuit. Sometimes on your scratch plate, you're also going to have a scratch plate that covers the control cavity. So you'll be putting foil on there. And what's interesting with that point is when you're putting your pots through it, the pots are making contact with the foil, with the metal sheet, and therefore they're making that part of the ground loop anyway. With a telly, we don't have a cavity cover that's plastic, we have a metal cavity cover, so it's automatically going to conduct the ground from the pots and become part of the loop, part of the circuit. Now I like to use these. I strip my wire, put it into these little eyelets, and then I can crimp it down, solder it in place, and screw it into the cavity. So what that means is as the screw's going into the body, it's making contact with the cavity shielding paint, and the screw head is making contact with the eyelet itself. So it's linking this wire to the cavity shielding. Now some people like to put on the cavity shielding paint before they put their top coat varnish on, which intuitively might sound an odd thing to do, but it still means you're coating your cavities in shielding, and if you then screw an eyelet in like this, you're breaking through that top surface of clear coat and making contact with the conductive paint underneath, so linking it all together. I obviously slipped a bit and I've marked the shielding, and what I'm actually revealing is the graphite that's in that paint. It's the graphite that really is the conductive element that causes the shielding. Now I've got those two wires screwed in to connect those two cavities. I'm cutting my wire at the right length so that I can then attach it to my pots. And not forgetting there's one more wire, the one I mentioned earlier, which is the wire that goes through to make contact with the base of the bridge plate. Sometimes I find it easiest just to twist those three wires together, then I can solder them all on in one joint. And then obviously everything needs to be soldered together. Now what I will just remind you of is I have that other video in which I did an experiment with how the shielding actually works. It's worth checking that out because it proves that shielding is really important. I'll link it in the description and in the video card. And what you'll notice that's quite important is I'm not actually going to put any of the cavity shielding on the inside of the hole where the input jack goes. And the reason for that is it's very easy for your jack, when it's in the input jack, to slip slightly or budge to one side or the other. Especially over time when you're pulling in and out your jack, it tends to cause the things inside to become a bit bent and a bit loose, and you don't want to risk it touching the outside and grounding itself, because that would short your signal out. This is a mistake I've seen lots of beginners make, and although I'm saying you shouldn't shield it, once you're really confident with what you're doing and you know there's no budge inside or using a certain type of jack, there's absolutely no reason not to do that. And when you're putting the screws on for the pickup, if your pickups have got springs underneath, I mean some of them have rubber underneath, but if they've got springs underneath, the springs are going to be making contact with that foil and linking everything together as well. By the way, this was a paint job I did for a client, and I've actually put a top coat on of nitro, which is a very specific type of nitro from NitorLACK. It's their relic finish, so it automatically cracks to make it look aged and old. The bare wood bits that are coming through I've made using one of my relic stencils. If you want to find out more about my relic stencils and how they work, subscribe and check out my videos. I'll be leaving a link in the description for this, as I will for the relic nitro from NitorLACK. I'm currently making a series of videos showing off that finish and some others from NitorLACK. Until next time, happy strumming.